in the general direction of a critical romantic socio-phenomenological humanist program of art, life and politics. Why? The primacy of the aesthetic will be the immovable core around which the following mythopoeic didactic treatise will, in all of its grand, elliptical tangents and furies, revolve, and the route back to which it will, from each expedition to the tip of every philosophical branch, lightly springing through paradox back to the ground, return. The primary thesis is simple, that art is essential to life. Such a simple idea, so obvious, almost tautology, that the appreciation and the creation of art are primary human activities, not means to ends, not byproducts, which by their very nature improve and enrich human life by making it something more than sleep, feeding and reproduction, ought to be uncontroversial, but nay, it is radical. Many will disagree, especially in the humanities where the notion of humanism is long in anathema, where human nature is taken to be a slogan of fascists. The notion that something, especially art, is of positive value does indeed invite the justified cries of essentialists, as we make no attempt to evade, as our primary thesis rests on a second, heuristic conviction, which will be pursued unrelentingly in every branch of thought we encounter. The opposition between the essential and the constructed is a nonsensical distinction, a false dichotomy, refusing all such arbitrary and false oppositions between the individual and the collective life, between the existence of stable structures and discontinuity, between the subjective phenomenological world of the psyche and the objective material space of historical praxis, between the stable recurrence of phylogenetic structures and the infinite variation and anomaly in the phenotypic expressions surrounding these constants, and conversely between the phylogenetic construction of difference and the phenotypic striving for unity. This paper will, by these deconstructive polemics, advance our program of aesthetic interpretation, which is both structuralist, unrepentantly Jungian, deeply and essentially subjectivist, and in equal measure iconoclastically critical, seeking the way to the universal through its anomalies. While this may be expressed in the rhetoric of dialectics, it is to be understood that the universal structures do not in any sense simply unfold in historical process, taking the rational and the emotional life of the subject as the primary point of dialectical reference, the only consistent and tangible thing that can be liberated. The process of history is in no sense something which must advance, but rather a set of contingencies in which we exercise choices. These are progressive insofar as they better for living, feeling, thinking, creative subjects to live in. Against the critical school, we assert the human subject structures the world and reacts to the social construction of itself, and is not purely constituted by the external, in which case no one would ever see fit to engage in resistance. Against the essentialist wing, the fetishists of the local, we revolt with equal refusal, insisting that we are all so much greater than the particulars of our surroundings, and at the risk of forgetting that those outside of your boundaries are human is very real. There are some examples. As John, a much earlier, Roger Bacon, too so lucidly stated, it is precisely in the particular nature of objects that the universality of their form is manifest. That is, they are not a chattel of some Platonic eidolon, but rather a given their form by their shared characteristics. Having asserted the beautiful's right to innately exist, we take up arms against all of the uses to which it is put, against the countless tyrannies which have made it their drudge, against the politicization of art, and with equal vehemence, against the aestheticization of the political, in pursuit of a world in which the aesthetic will be free, as the free occupation of free human beings, the fullest expression of humankind's casting away of the yoke of hierarchy, of alienation, of nation and state, of all distinctions which make of us anything but our greatest selves. It is thus by unapologetic and zealous polemics, making no pretense of being analytically neutral, bearing the cosmopolitan standard of human potential into the struggle that ends only when absolute liberation lifts from humanity's countenance the veil of estrangement, revealing as one the singular, secular, local, and universal, inextricably intertwined, but autonomous aspects of one human world, united in free self-creation, that we advance this modest thesis, that the unrepentant celebration of creative life is essential, as archetypal, is not only compatible with, but complementary, nay, essential to the critical radical project of dismantling, exposing, denouncing and of destroying everything which arbitrarily limits our human potential. This consists in destroying much which has impersonated the beautiful human potential which we wish to elevate. As Benjamin has made clear, the aesthetic has never been neutral, having been made the scion of exoteric religion, the veil of fascism and the cudgel of Stalinist mythos. It is as much an atrocity to refuse and renounce the beautiful for the uses that have been made of it, as it is to renounce food because the rich have so much of it. There could be no philosophy of liberation more inherently bourgeois than that. We will contend against all prescriptions and prohibitions, against the demand that art be conservative, or in turn radical, against the notion that art is alone a means to liberation, and by all means against the notion that art is bourgeois, that art, as the freest and fullest expression of the human being, of the eudaimonic fullness of the individual, of the affective bonds of the groups these individuals constitute, and the ultimate bond of mutual appreciation, by which human beings across gaping chasms of geography, language, custom and bitter resentments over the always gushing wounds of history's carnage, are finally free to experience, in its immense variation, the most basic creative act that makes us all human. That this fullness of human collective and individual life should be released from the fetters of our theoretical and practical demands and allowed to be. This is to say that art should cease to be a subject about which we debate its utility as an instrument of revolutionary action, and this instrumental attitude on the part of the goons of ideology should be seen for what it is, a clear indication of what they intend to do with human beings, given the opportunity. Any person, any institution, any set of dense and abstruse academic affirmations, refusals or prescriptions which make of human creativity either a slave or an enemy, or which tries to make it over in its own image, whatever the lofty and liberatory pretexts, cannot be trusted to respect a human being. It is thus that art must become the end of all progressive human projects, the goal of human freedom. Thus the goal of this paper will be a unified program of art, life, politics and metaphysics. This, of course, we cannot achieve in this ministerial lifetime, but, it is hoped, in striving toward this parabolic end, we will at least succeed in advancing our primary doctrine. Art is not radical, art is not reactionary, it is a primary act, a basic human necessity. 2. How, again, we reiterate, lest jaded eyes scan this paper too quickly, the primacy of the aesthetic will be our primal directive. This point will be made in the context of a didactic polemic, through the refusal of much of philosophy's violent denial of the living, reasoning and feeling life of humanity, and of the possibility of a positive nature, one which is driven by empathy and the communal instinct. This hostility has been evident in the works, even, perhaps especially, of those who would assert the contrary, from Kant, who, wishing to free subjectivity from outside interest, betrays a fear of the sensual life in his rigid abstraction, or to the, albeit laudable, quest of Adorno, who, while desiring to free the world from tyrannical concepts, makes of the subject which it is his intention to free, a tabula rasa byproduct of economic conditions, and in seeking to free this arbitrary construction from the misuses and lies to which art and aesthetics are turned, despite his liberatory intentions, does so by prescription, by imposing his own rigid, ideological concept, in a dogmatic refusal to let human beings seek enjoyment, seeing art which people might just enjoy as inherently bourgeois. Meanwhile, he makes human nature a purely bourgeois construction. 5. Thus stamping out the positive unity identity toward which his breaking of false representation should positively aspire. Here we are said that Schiller, slighted in every account, painted a picture of the psyche and social existence which celebrated the subject, as well as social existence, in a manner which was inclusive of all facets of life. Centering his phenomenology in what Newman terms centroversion, Schiller avoids the rigid divisions of life into formal and sensual, rational and emotional, subjective internal and objective social life, resulting in a philosophy which gives respect to the subject, on the one hand, as a pre-social feeling and reasoning being, and at the same time, the subject's immersion in social existence. Western philosophers after Schiller will carry the blame for the simplistic, one-sided, unyielding divisions characterizing our intellectual world's conceptions of society, subjectivity, and human nature, which, seizing upon and amplifying, in isolation, singular facets of the totality of human experience, which Schiller treated synthetically and centered in the Kantian subject, and, in turn, denying the facets championed by others, engage in a war of illusions concerning the Ding and Sich, and despite the fact that their impetus to liberation might be undertaken with the utmost sincerity, they violently tear apart the phenomenal world of the person. Not in a way which breaks down illusions and brings liberation, but in a way which denies and does violence to the human being. We shall insist upon a return to the integral wholeness, the inclusive humanism of Schiller's synthesis, and upon the pursuit, both in critical social theory, and the interpretive critical treatment of art and aesthetics, of modes of humanity's criticism which are humanistic. Only thus can we avoid the atrocious extremes of our fissured legacy, which have their end in a world divided, dismembered by the putrescent ideological trinity, that of the Völkisch, universality within the confines of state, race and nation, that of the Stalinistic collective technocratic machine, universality under the yoke of omnipotent power, and of estrangement, individuality conceived as pure isolation, possessing no nature but that which pertains to the pursuit of profit. This will be done by seeking exemplars in the world of thought, who in the making, and in the criticism of art, and in the critical quest to alter our social conditions, do so in ways which respect and celebrate creative life, and the emotional, rational life of the subject, without which there is no subjective, nor any objective world to engage with, without whose existence, there is no point of critical reference, and no reason to care either way about subject or object, without whose subjective response and refusal of culture's directives, we are left without reason to condone or to criticize anything. In turn, such exemplary figures, in elevating the subject, never once lose sight of the social, outside of which the subject is free and alone, but lies heaving, often mistaking these last frantic flailings for true inspiration, whereas the communist mistakes the fish for the surrounding water, and the fascist shark, devouring all of his comrades, claims to alone represent the beautiful and boundless sea, and yet again, the bourgeois fisherman lures us all shoreward, dangling morsels into the sunlight of alienation, promising lonely prosperity, casting us onto the seashore, where the nefarious fire of capital hungrily greets us, the licking flames laughing at our newfound freedom to be someone's dinner, where each and every one of these ways of making the world violently lays down its laws, always with the pretext of freedom. The humanistic exemplar wishes to let it exist, always maintaining a faith in life's life-giving potential, trusting that life, in all of its many created dimensions, being much older than any life it can ever remember, ought to be trusted to go on without our violent enforcement. But, as we make this assertion, let us not let optimism turn into quaintness, let not the positive turn to naivete. It is true, if our inherited nature is a component, integral to the historical dialectical process, if such a nature is the mother of love and of kindness, if it is the basis of progress and social improvement, the force of Eros which subtly draws the heart into its springtime. Yes, in admitting into our ontology a loving nature, we indeed also open ourselves to the spectre of genetic evil, and every terrible scapegoating news it has ever been put to. Let us first of all be clear, if there is such an evil, then it is one which is shared unequally by everybody. Let us, with constant vigilance, tear out the tongues of those sophists, popularizers of vulgar and philistine interpretations which turn the human capacity for cruelty into a mandate, brandishing high the fallacious flag of quad-estate democracy, turning our greatest vehemence towards those who would make our worst traits, or even our bests, the properties of one race or one nation, or an apologia for our present conceptions of gender, of power, and of the craving for consumer garbage. Having thus cast these demons back into the medieval, let us not be deluded about the human condition. With our capacity for love, empathy, and mutual aid comes the capacity also for cruelty and domination, for the irrational hatred of others, and for masochism. Neither these, nor the nurturing, life-seeking aspects of a human being are without their debt to the body, but it is the social life that we create around us which, in its ideological and its physical shaping of the subjective faculties, which, by their own creation, the social mind body that lives in the space between myriad subjects, are in turn created, acted upon from outside. This creates, for the subject, conditions which are conducive either to the preponderance of our best or our worst nature. It is thus contingent upon the creative subject, whether in art, or in politics, or in everyday life, to always strive to create the conditions which bring forth the good. The creative exemplar, in representing the world, in the positive and honest celebration of life, is distinguished from the Pollyannas of quaintness, the Hell of the sitcom Gemeinschaft, the Thomas Kincaids of the world, by the fact that they always keep, in clear visibility, all of the violence and sadness that lives with the joy of this world, in all of its hideous grandeur, all of history's murder. Always keeping in sight this violence and fragmentation, they do not stop, satisfied with merely dispelling the lie. Rather, they seek to snatch these violent, irrational forces back from the clutches of tyranny, war and human estrangement, putting them back in their natural place in the song of existence, as with Kropotkin, whose sometimes overly rosy view of human nature never once tries to deny the existence of violence and hatred, but rather to create a world in which these forces are always directed, not towards our fellow human beings, nor the earth which sustains us, but rather, always, relentlessly towards every form of power, towards everything which prevents us from living freely together, and in the poems of Tagore, in which death, dissolution and sorrow are the very conditions by which life in its beauty and continuity is renewed, and is seen as joyous. 9. As an exemplar in the field of musicology, there is no figure greater than that of Moses Ashe, whose folk cosmopolitanism embodies the ethic of Schiller's fourth letter, celebrating the universal through its subjective manifestation in the local, thus refusing all contradictions between the interests of the individual's culture, and those of the common body of humanity. As a phenomenological exemplar, we have Jung, whose psychology of individuation closely reflects Schiller's dialectic to transcend the oppositions of reason and sensuality through the free play of the faculties, and finally through the attainment of the aesthetic state, in which the contradiction between the drives is resolved in the synthetic third state. This is analogous to Yule's dialectic to unify inner and outer experience, and that of the conscious and unconscious aspects of the self. A very much longer and far more detailed edition of this work will extend this list in great biographical detail. As we are here constrained by the limits of time and space, we will constrain our survey to Kropotkin, Jung and Chagall. The first is a humanistic alternative to the abstractions and denials of the subject by Marxian theorists, whose program provides us with every bit as relentless a critique of the social order and its misdirection of human instinct as anything the critical school has ever produced, in a style the regular people, uneducated in jargon, can understand. Jung provides us with a psychological model for interpreting art and literature which assumes that the unconscious is a positive, prospective and purposive force and not the reductive waste dump of the Freudians. Finally, Chagall, as an artist brazenly walking the tightrope of errors between the jagged cliffs of the sublime and the beautiful, over the gaping abyss of the trite and never once stumbling, presents us with the exemplary picture of art as the expression of life in its absolute totality. The first two are theoretical exemplars, the latter practical and certainly not to be understood as the only way to make art. The Schillerian synthesis of the faculties, like the Aristotelian mean, cannot be achieved through prescription, but is relative to the contingencies of place, time and subject. Chagall, making no distinction between his sentimental Gemeinschaftsgefühl for his native Vitebsk, and his feelings of total unity with the whole world, is one example of how an individual can achieve this in his or her life and historical context. After a brief elaboration on the basic principles of Jung and Kropotkin, this work will end with an analysis of the works of Chagall, as well as some other artists who have dealt with similar motifs, attempting to demonstrate that culture, history and nature are neither arbitrarily constructed nor simply inherited, but are constituted by an infinitely complex play of structural continuity with contextual and individual idiosyncrasy and anomaly. And that the universal is constituted by the shared nature of variant particulars, thus rendering the distinction arbitrary and false. 3. Kropotkin. The works of Peter Kropotkin exemplify Schiller's statement in Letter VI of Letters upon the aesthetical education of man that a healthy and harmonious state of humanity cannot be achieved by the coercive means of the state. Can this effect of harmony be attained by the state? That is not possible, for the state, as at present constituted, has given occasion to evil, and the state, as conceived in the idea, instead of being able to establish this more perfect humanity, ought to be based upon it. The primary difference between Schiller and Kropotkin is that the latter, rather than seeking a state that truly embodies the will of a fully developed humanity, insists that the very existence of the state is, by its very nature, incompatible with the natural social instincts of human beings, and that society, in order for humanity to achieve its potential, must be organized by means of voluntary cooperative organizations, which both ensure the liberty of the individual and provide for the common needs of the group, without which the development of the individual is impossible. Whereas the bourgeois conception of the individual, one characterized by pure selfishness and the pursuit of profit, junk food and pornography, reduces the subject to a slovenly, isolated bundle of desires. The corresponding Marxian abstraction reduces the individual to an epiphenomenon of history, praxis, infrastructure, the state, or any number of other abstractions. These dichotomous forms of organization and ideology perfectly embody Schiller's concepts of savagery and barbarism, and both are intrinsically hostile both to the living human beings and to the needs of the communities which they comprise. Kropotkin presents a picture of human nature which is, contrary to both the tabula rasa model, still popular in the social sciences, and to the essentially negative and destructive concept of the will which has been dispersed throughout Western culture by the descendants of Schopenhauer, positive, and which is characterized by a natural tendency towards social existence and cooperation. If the empirical philosophers have hitherto failed to prove the progress of moral conceptions, which may be the leading principle of evolution, the fault lies to a great extent with the speculative, that is, the non-scientific philosophers. They have so strongly denied the empirical origin of man's moral feelings, they have gone to such subtle reasoning in order to assign a supernatural origin to the moral sense, and they have spoken so much about the destination of man, the way of his existence, and the aim of nature, that a reaction against the mythological and metaphysical conceptions which have risen round this question was unavoidable. Moreover, The modern evolutionists, having established the presence in the animal world of a keen struggle for life among different species, could not accept such a brutal process which entails so much suffering upon sentient beings, as the expression of a supreme being, and they consequently denied that any ethical principle could be discovered in it. Only now that the evolution of species, races of men, human institutions, and of ethical ideas themselves, has been proved to be the result of natural forces, has it become possible to study all the factors of this evolution, including the ethical factor of mutual support and growing sympathy, without the risk of falling back into a supernatural philosophy. But, this being so, we reach a point of considerable philosophical importance. We are enabled to conclude that the lesson which man derives from the study of nature and his own history is the permanent presence of a double tendency towards a greater development, on the one side of sociality, and, on the other side, of a consequent increase of the intensity of life, which results in an increase of happiness for the individuals, and in progress, physical, intellectual, and moral. This double tendency is a distinctive characteristic of life in general. It is always present, and belongs to life, as one of its attributes, whatever aspects life may take on our planet or elsewhere. And this is not a metaphysical assertion of the universality of the moral law, or a mere supposition. Without the continual growth of sociality, and consequently of the intensity and variety of sensations, life is impossible. Therein lies its essence. If that element is lacking, life tends to ebb, to disintegrate, to cease. This may be recognized as an empirically discovered law of nature. While developing this positive and humanistic concept of the social instinct throughout his career as a biologist, Kropotkin in no sense denies the existence of impulses which can be turned towards violence and coercion. Indeed, the very worst possibilities of human behavior are observable on a daily basis, serving the ends of selfish acquisition and social privilege. But he insists that all of the natural instincts which are directed to such ends can be turned to positive, socially constructive ends, and have simply been misdirected toward oppressive ends. We have hitherto been speaking of the conscious, deliberate actions of man, those performed intentionally. But side by side with our conscious life we have an unconscious life which is very much wider. Yet we have only to notice how we dress in the morning, trying to fasten a button that we know we lost last night, or stretching out our hands to take something that we ourselves have moved away, to obtain an idea of this unconscious life and realize the enormous part it plays in our existence. It makes up 3/4 of our relations with others, our ways of speaking, smiling, frowning, getting heated or keeping cool in a discussion, or unintentional, the result of habits inherited from our human or pre-human ancestors. Only notice the likeness in expression between an angry man and an angry beast, or else consciously or unconsciously acquired. Our manner of acting towards others thus tends to become habitual. To treat others as he would wish to be treated himself becomes with man and all sociable animals simply a habit, so much so that a person does not generally even ask himself how he must act under such and such circumstances. It is only when the circumstances are exceptional, in some complex case or under the impulse of strong passion, that he hesitates, and a struggle takes place between the various portions of his brain, for the brain is a very complex organ, the various portions of which act to a certain degree independently. When this happens, the man substitutes himself in imagination for the person opposed to him. He asks himself if he would like to be treated in such a way, and the better he has identified himself with the person whose dignity or interest he has been on the point of injuring, the more moral will his decision be. Or maybe a friend steps in and says to him, "Fancy yourself in his place. Should you have suffered from being treated by him as he has been treated by you?" And this is enough. Thus we only appeal to the principle of equality in moments of hesitation, and in 99 cases out of 100 act morally from habit. It must have been obvious that in all we have hitherto said, we have not attempted to enjoin anything, we have only set forth the manner in which things happen in the animal world and amongst mankind. Formerly the church threatened them with hell to moralize them, and she succeeded in demoralizing them instead. The judge threatens with imprisonment, flogging, the gallows, in the name of those social principles he has filched from society, and he demoralizes them. And yet the very idea that the judge may disappear from the earth at the same time as the priest causes authoritarians of every shade to cry out about peril to society. But we are not afraid to forego judges and their sentences. We forego sanctions of all kinds, even obligations to morality. We are not afraid to say, do what you will, act as you will, because we are persuaded that the great majority of mankind, in proportion to their degree of enlightenment and the completeness with which they free themselves from existing fetters, will behave and act always in a direction useful to society, just as we are persuaded beforehand that a child will one day walk on its 2 feet and not on all 4 simply because it is born of parents belonging to the genus Homo. All we can do is to give advice, and again while giving it we add, this advice will be valueless if your own experience and observation do not lead you to recognize that it is worth following. When we see a youth stooping and so contracting his chest and lungs, we advise him to straighten himself, hold up his head and open his chest. We advise him to fill his lungs and take long breaths, because this will be his best safeguard against consumption. But at the same time we teach him physiology that he may understand the functions of his lungs, and himself choose the posture he knows to be the best. And this is all we can do in the case of morals. We have only a right to give advice, to which we add, follow it if it seems good to you, but while leaving to each the right to act as he thinks best, while utterly denying the right of society to punish one in any way for any anti-social act he may have committed. We do not forego our own capacity to love what seems to us good and to hate what seems to us bad. Love and hate, for only those who know how to hate know how to love. We keep this capacity, and as this alone serves to maintain and develop the moral sentiments in every animal society, so much the more will it be enough for the human race. We only ask one thing, to eliminate all that impedes the free development of these 2 feelings in the present society, all that perverts our judgment, the state, the church, exploitation, judges, priests, governments, exploiters. Today when we see a Jack the Ripper murder one after another some of the poorest and most miserable of women, our first feeling is one of hatred. If we had met him the day when he murdered that woman who asked him to pay her for her slum lodging, we should have put a bullet through his head, without reflecting that the bullet might have been better bestowed in the brain of the owner of that wretched den. But when we recall to mind all the infamies which have brought him to this, when we think of the darkness in which he prowls haunted by images drawn from indecent books or thoughts suggested by stupid books, our feeling is divided. And if someday we hear that Jack is in the hands of some judge who has slain in cold blood a far greater number of men, women and children than all the Jacks together, if we see him in the hands of one of those deliberate maniacs, then all our hatred of Jack the Ripper will vanish. It will be transformed into hatred of a cowardly and hypocritical society and its recognized representatives. All the infamies of a Ripper disappear before that long series of infamies committed in the name of law. It is this we hate. For Kropotkin, much like Schiller, the development of this positive and constructive human nature finds its fullest state in the pursuit of creative play. In Kropotkin's philosophy of revolution, the expropriation of the basic, physical means of life is only a minor precursor to the true goal of creating an environment in which individuals can flourish as fully creative human beings. He sees this, not as a distant goal, to be achieved at the end of history, after a long process of social engineering, but as an immediate, primary human need, as important as food, clean water, shelter and medicine. Man is not a being whose exclusive purpose in life is eating, drinking, and providing a shelter for himself. As soon as his material wants are satisfied, other needs, which, generally speaking, may be described as of an artistic character, will thrust themselves forward. These needs are of the greatest variety, they vary with each and every individual, and the more society is civilized, the more will individuality be developed, and the more will desires be varied. Even today we see men and women denying themselves necessaries to acquire mere trifles, to obtain some particular gratification, or some intellectual or material enjoyment. A Christian or an ascetic may disapprove of these desires for luxury, but it is precisely these trifles that break the monotony of existence and make it agreeable. Would life, with all its inevitable drudge and sorrows, be worth living, if, besides daily work, man could never obtain a single pleasure according to his individual tastes? If we wish for a social revolution, it is no doubt, first of all, to give bread to everyone, to transform this execrable society, in which we can every day see capable workmen dangling their arms for want of an employer who will exploit them, women and children wandering shelterless at night, whole families reduced to dry bread, men, women, and children dying for want of care and even for want of food. It is to put an end to these iniquities that we rebel, but we expect more from the revolution. We see that the worker, compelled to struggle painfully for bare existence, is reduced to ignore the higher delights, the highest within man's reach, of science, and especially of scientific discovery, of art, and especially of artistic creation. It is in order to obtain for all of us joys that are now reserved to a few, in order to give leisure and the possibility of developing everyone's intellectual capacities, that the social revolution must guarantee daily bread to all. After bread has been secured, leisure is the supreme aim. No doubt, nowadays, when hundreds and thousands of human beings are in need of bread, coal, clothing, and shelter, luxury is a crime. To satisfy it, the worker's child must go without bread. But in a society in which all have the necessary food and shelter, the needs which we consider luxuries today will be the more keenly felt. And as all men do not and cannot resemble one another, the variety of tastes and needs is the chief guarantee of human progress. There will always be, and it is desirable that there should always be, men and women whose desire will go beyond those of ordinary individuals in some particular direction. Everybody does not need a telescope, because, even if learning were general, there are people who prefer to examine things through a microscope to studying the starry heavens. Some like statues, some like pictures. A particular individual has no other ambition than to possess a good piano, while another is pleased with an accordion. The tastes vary, but the artistic needs exist in all. In our present, poor capitalistic society, the man who has artistic needs cannot satisfy them unless he is heir to a large fortune, or by dint of hard work appropriates to himself an intellectual capital which will enable him to take up a liberal profession. Still he cherishes the hope of someday satisfying his tastes more or less, and for this reason he reproaches the idealist communist societies with having the material life of each individual as their sole aim. In your communal stores you may perhaps have bread for all, he says to us, but you will not have beautiful pictures, optical instruments, luxurious furniture, artistic jewelry, in short, the many things that minister to the infinite. Pg 97. Variety of human tastes, and you suppress the possibility of obtaining anything beside the bread and meat which the commune can offer to all, and the drab linen in which all your later citizens will be dressed. These are the objections which all communist systems have to consider, and which the founders of new societies, established in American deserts, never understood. They believed that if the community could procure sufficient cloth to dress all its members, a music room in which the brothers could strum a piece of music, or act a play from time to time, it was enough. They forgot that the feeling for art existed in the agriculturist as well as in the burgher, and, notwithstanding that the expression of artistic feeling varies according to the difference in culture, in the main it remains the same. In vain did the community guarantee the common necessaries of life, in vain did it suppress all education that would tend to develop individuality, in vain did it eliminate all reading save the Bible. Individual taste broke forth, and caused general discontent. Quarrels arose when somebody proposed to buy a piano or scientific instrument entanglements, and the elements of progress flagged, the society could only exist on condition that it crushed all individual feeling, all artistic tendency, and all development. Will the anarchist commune be impelled by the same direction? Evidently not, if it understands that while it produces all that is necessary to material life, it must also strive to satisfy all manifestations of the human mind. In Kropotkin's philosophy, we see a far more nuanced understanding of the nature of the individual and the group, of both human nature and human culture, than one can find in all of the bankrupt, sophistic jargon which conceals the simplistic, anti-humanistic truisms of the current approaches to the humanities, in which liberation is whimpered from every seminar table by either fork-tongued, or maybe just ingenuous, Frodo. Marxian devotees who reduce the very human beings they wish to liberate either to empty vessels full of the current ideological order, whose liberation can only consist in wiping their blank slate clean, filling it up with vacuous jargon that signifies nothing, or on the other hand to hostile, contemptible creatures utterly bent on power, conquest, and domination. These should be swept away and replaced with Kropotkin's vision, which includes every aspect of human life and potential, never forgetting the good, always turning the bad toward the good, always remembering that any act we perform in the world is not an epiphenomenon of academic abstractions, but something which affects real, living human beings. This is a vision through which we, both as artists and critics, might drag our creaky old bodies back out of these musty old classrooms, and brandishing proudly our handfuls of flowers and Molotov cocktails, learn once again how to love and to hate in all of the right ways. For a briefer and slightly less passionate look at Jungian theory as a heuristic resolution to the opposition between the socio-political world and that of the psyche. In the works of Jung and Erich Neumann, the development of the individual is recapitulated in mythic symbol in the form of the heroic quests. This narrative is read as an allegory for the emergence of the ego complex out of unconsciousness and the struggle for mastery over the conscious environment. Jung likens this journey to the path of the rising and setting sun, and the final battle with the adversarial shadow with a battle between the light of consciousness and the darkness of instinct and unconsciousness. In terms of Piaget's developmental psychology, this represents our progression from sensory-motor functions of accommodation, retreat, and diffuse sensation toward the opposite poles of assimilation, focus, and approach, by which the organism attains mastery over objects in the environment and creates order and symmetry in the ranking of perceptual objects. In both theories of consciousness, the subject must alternate between the analogous poles in order to maintain harmony with the environment. Jung describes development in terms of contrary drives in the conscious and unconscious mind. The contents of the unconscious are seeking to emerge or erupt into the light of conscious life, while the ego is constantly faced with its own desire to descend into unconsciousness for relief and renewal. In Piaget's psychology, this oscillating movement is simply referred to as equilibrium, and in Jung the corresponding concept is the transcendent function by which the psyche is constantly driven forward in its development by the regrouping of psychic contents into new complexes, as contents emerge from the unconscious and descend in new complex formations back into the unconscious. In the mythic narrative, these functions are expressed by the hero's struggle against his own inferior qualities, between the concern for cultural achievement and the distractions of rage and sexual temptation, and in the end the descent to the dead or the night's journey, during which Enes spoke with an attempted reconciliation with the departed, and returned with a new understanding of the conscious world. These two theoretical interpretations are synthesized in the work of Jungian sociologist Richard M. Gray, who considers Piaget's schematic functions, along with innate releasing mechanisms, to be the basis of the Jungian archetypes. As we noted, from the Piagetian standpoint, Learning consists in the assimilation of the new behavior to pre-existing schemata. From the Jungian perspective, we may translate this to mean that learning consists in the assimilation of new behaviors to archetypal expectancies. Gray combines with this Newman's concept of the cultural canon. Just as the ego coalesces out of the early interactions between competing archetypal dominants, so every group coalesces about a certain set of commonly activated archetypal contents which tends to characterize its function, purpose and direction. In other words, the formation of conscious individuals into social groups is analogous to the constellation of images, thoughts, emotions, etc. into complexes within the individual psyche. This parallelism between internal organism and a social totality is analogous to the socio-psychological taxonomy shared by both Schiller and Kropotkin. Thus, the myth and literature of a given culture can be seen as representing the complexes on the level of collective psychology. Gray's synthesis provides a theoretical bridge from the level of the collective unconscious, the result of our inherited brain structure, psychological types, 616, to the level of mass culture and the state. With this understanding, one can both appreciate the work for the inherent value of its imagery and narrative structure as symbols of personal growth and development, while also being critical of the functions that myth serves at the cultural level. 5. Shagala's exemplar of psychic totality, opposites in transformation and the quest for unity. This section will be a tenuous attempt to apply the critical approach proposed in the sections above, proposing that erotic unity, as depicted in the works of Marc Chagall, embodies the Schillerian principle of total synthesis between sense and form, particular and universal, and the external objective and internal subjective world of fantasy, and comes as close as is possible to a visual demonstration of Kant's free play of the faculties, much like Moby Dick, or the surrealistic songs of Townes Van Zandt. Chagall's depictions of lovers give very little information to the viewer, but bombard the senses with imagery that demands interpretation, thus drawing the image away from any particular interpretation. In their indeterminacy, they embody the complete range of possible subject scenarios. His motifs direct the mind beyond all determinate structures, and straight to the form primitive, as described in Ramachandran's theory of art. 5.1 Theoretical frame. In this section, we will briefly examine the concept of eros as a primary drive toward unity, harmony, symmetry, and the reconciliation and synthesis of perceived oppositions, both within the individual psyche, and in the social world of which the individual is an inseparable part, and its many obstacles and failures, as they are presented in the surrealist mystic visions of Chagall, the literary myths of Ovid, and the traditional ballads which survived in oral transmission until recently in the Appalachian region, as sung by Jean Ritchie. Drawing from a general theoretical framework rooted in Jung's analytical psychology, Piaget's constructivist developmental psychology, Levi Strauss's theory of binary mediation. This analysis will attempt to synthesize these structuralist theories of internal psychological processes with the deconstructive project, accounting for the ways in which myth, symbol and narrative can be both the essential foundations of human growth and positive transformation, as well as the means by which arbitrary and fallacious structures are projected onto the world, resulting in a disjunction and asymmetry between individuals and the social body in which they exist. By straddling the fence between essentialism and constructionism, it will hopefully be possible to establish a critical perspective which can be radically critical of the end to which art is often turned, and the ways in which our narratives justify or eternalize existing social orders, while simultaneously recognizing the generative structures of consciousness and the common emotional life of humankind from which the symbols and narrative structures arise as a vital, essential, and positive generative force, which form the unconscious basis for all human growth and positive development, thus also constituting a normative basis for criticism and resistance, through creative activity, to the repressive and life-negating forces which surround us. In this way we may, without in any sense becoming conservatives or Platonists, work toward the establishment of a truly life-affirming aesthetics, capable of recognizing the infinite variations of culture as the manifestations of a common, inherited, creative inner life. 5.2 Love suspended in timeless night. The theme which exemplifies this primary drive for unity is that of the lovers, a theme which Marc Chagall, 1887-1985, painted obsessively throughout his very long life, primarily inspired by his relationship with his first wife, Bella, of whom he said, "Her eyes are mine, her silence is mine, I feel she has known me always, my childhood, my present life, my future, as though she were watching over me, divining my innermost being, though this is the first time I have seen her. I knew this was she, my wife. Her pale coloring, her eyes, how big and round and black they are my eyes, my soul in these works. The boundaries between lover, beloved, world and time are obscured. The lovers stand, or more often float, often with bodies merged, both with soft, androgynous features, the boundaries of which seem to grow out of the surrounding darkness, to draw their semiotic sustenance through the thick substance of night from the miniature worlds that float around them. These images exemplify Newman's ideal characterization of the artist's psyche, in which the ego, fully formed, descends again into the self, into the world of unitary experience that precedes the emergence of ego consciousness, where the boundaries between self and mother and world are not fully formed, drawing the contents of the creative act from the generative depths of the unconscious. The dream lore of his paintings flows from a unity of feeling, reflected not only in the intrinsic color development but also in the relationship between the symbols that order themselves around the symbolic center of the picture. The unity and force of conviction in his pictures are an expression of the obedience with which he accepts the intention of his unconscious. The metaphor of the artist's created world as a partial reconstruction of the original identity with the mother is attested by Chagall's answer when he was asked what has driven you as an artist. His only answer was, "My mother loved me and believed in me, and I wanted to justify myself in her eyes." With the exception of his terrible 5-year relationship with Virginia McNeil, from 1945, shortly after Bella's death, until 1952, when he met Valentine Vavabrodsky, who would remain with him until his death. Chagall's career divides into two halves of roughly 3 decades, throughout both of which he had a partner willing to take on this role, to act as the source of creative inspiration by accepting his projections. This is not to say that Chagall himself was a perfect human being. When he found out that Virginia was leaving him, he beat her repeatedly. Nevertheless, though his massive ego and violent temper clearly do not embody the principles we are observing in his work, his life as a whole, perhaps out of pure luck, seems to have unfolded in a perfect symmetry which reflects the vision he expressed in his paintings. These depictions of love will be our central point of reference. This symbolic expression of perfect wholeness can be seen as a perfect form, all-embracing, neither moving nor motionless, which contains the latent potential for all of the possible stories, beautiful, tragic, and revolting, that could result as soon as the contents are thrown into disequilibrium. We will consider the other works as symbolic processes which strive toward the unity of Chagall's mystic vision, but for various reasons negated in the process. In Ovid's The Ramas and Thisbe and the ballads Dear Orsini, The House Carpenter, and False Sir John, sung by Jean Ritchie, we will see just a few of the transformations which the characters in these stories move through as the symbolic structures of the narrative strive for the unity exemplified in Chagall's master form, and fail. In these examples, the failures come in 2 forms. The first, in the ballads of courting, deceit and murder, False Sir John and the House Carpenter being total disequilibrium, when one pole in a symbolic opposition totally negates or assimilates its opposite. In Pagetian terms, an allegorical representation of the failure to establish a line of equilibration between the perceptual poles of assimilation and accommodation. In Jungian terms, the domination of the self by an unchecked, hypertrophied complex, and a second, in the stories of forbidden love and suicide told in Ovid's Paramus and Thespian Dirocini, being total negation, when the natural drive toward unification is violently repressed in order to serve the ends of a superordinate order, with tragic results, the total domination of the self by a tyrannical persona and the compensatory immersion of the entire personality into the unconscious, which manifests at the collective level in the form of institutional domination over the lives, identities, and relationships of human beings. Like Plotinus scintilla emanating from the one, we can imagine these distorted and stifled attempts among the microcosmic paintings within paintings that fade in and out of focus, embedded in the opaque boundary of night that surrounds the figures at the center of Chagall's paintings, submerged in the darkness just below the threshold of perception, crying enviously through many eternities as they gaze up through the images of Chagall's childhood in Vitebsk, through the other, to see love suspended between heaven and earth, past and future, light and darkness, poised upon Eliot's still point of the turning world, all of the images of the village and its animals, of the fertile earth emerging out of the depths of unconscious night, to culminate not in the brutal conquest of the darkness by the light, nor in the absorption of all things by the dark, but by the perfect synthesis of unity and multiplicity, in which the boundaries of self and other, past and present, earth and heaven remain, but emerge together as part of one indissoluble whole as they melt into the soft obscurity of moonlight. 5.3 Omnipresence, pregnant with the future, points of narrative departure in Chagall's Elatent. The title of Chagall's Elatent, Waiting, is unremarkable and ambiguous. The painting depicts a couple, apparently lovers, walking together in the night, a motif which makes up the subject matter of an immense quantity of his work, and the one for which he is best known, so much so that more than a few people probably don't know that he painted anything else. Ironically, the positions of the characters in the painting, the ambivalent mood that it conveys, and the eeriness of the kinds of images that emerge out of the dark perimeter stand in marked contrast to many of his other depictions of this theme. Most of his other works on this theme place the two lovers in direct embrace, and often physically merge together, as in Le Champ de Mars, in which the faces of the lovers overlap, the man's face seemingly growing out of the woman's head, whose body is marked only by a lighter-hued section of the blue-tinted night that surrounds them, rising up out of the village below, embraced by a crescent moon on the left and a full moon, or perhaps a sun, on the right. They appear as though they will always be right there, as though all that had come before and all that could be had dropped out of time, leaving only Paris, Vitebsk, an earthy peasant mother, the ever-present fertility rooster, and the lovers, hovering there in unchanging bliss. The subject's gender features are often obscured into a soft mutual androgyny. In Le Champ de Mars, the two heads share one hand, and one cannot tell who gave the bouquet of flowers to whom. The merged bodies are usually indistinguishable from the night itself, which surrounds and pervades everything as though it were not simply the absence of light, but a tangible substance. In Blue Landscape, 1949, the lovers have no bodies at all. As their bodies are submerged into the night, the faint image of a second set of lovers emerges out of the dark behind them. The subject matter shifts in relation to its surroundings as elements in the field of vision sink into darkness and unconsciousness, and new variations on the subject emerge from the dark. The animals, which are almost always present in Chagall's paintings, merge into the surrounding night just like their human companions, and often merge completely with other objects in the paintings. The moon in Blue Landscape is a fish, swimming through the night sky, which, in turn, merges with the ocean below. In another painting, also entitled Blue Landscape, 1958, the moon merges with the lovers themselves, and the night is illuminated by a clock, presumably motionless. In others, such as The Rooster in Love, 1947, lovers, animals, earth and sky form one great mass. Every entity remains distinguishable, and the differences between the subjects do not simply disappear. The structure of the scene maintains itself without ever falling into abstraction, but all oppositions have disappeared. Sets of opposites have transformed into an interconnected tapestry of harmonious contrasts, in which the boundaries of the characters merge together. Above, below, light, darkness, human and animal, conscious and unconscious, male and female are, in these paintings, inseparable components of a unified organic whole. In contrast to these visions of perfect unity, El Attent has the pair walking in the same direction. As in the other paintings, neither is touching the ground. The woman's body emerges out of the night, over the distant village. The entire lower body of the man is hidden behind the donkey that walks beside him, and the entire upper body of the woman is surrounded by a green rooster, which floats behind her, filling the background of the painting. The boundaries between the characters and their surroundings are as obscure as in other paintings, but in this one, the lovers are not merged together, nor are they even in physical contact. They are not facing one another. The woman floats ahead of and above the man, who is much smaller than she is. He stands back with a slightly bewildered look on his pale face, with his arm around his donkey, who gazes out of the canvas with a sort of sly, mysterious squint and a half smile, like the Mona Lisa would have if she were a donkey. In response to Chagall's other love paintings, one might reasonably expect viewers to divide more or less consistently into two groups, one of which is sentimental and inclined toward mystic obfuscation, which will view the work as profound, and another group which is cynical, practical, inclined to think that these images serve only as a distraction from the many problems of the world which urgently need to be addressed. This painting, however, does not share the sense of quaint, blissful certainty. Its most alluring, as well as its most terrifying aspect, is the uncertainty which pervades it. The darkness, which in all of his paintings clings around the bodies of the lovers, in this painting also lies between them and separates them. Aside from their animals, the objects in the periphery are obscured by the dark, which serves as the only boundary framing the scene. What at one moment brought the figures into focus suddenly becomes a source of ambivalence. All of the unconscious variables by which we could know the true nature of the situation lie outside of our view, as well as that of the characters. In such an atmosphere of uncertainty, they might be happy, but are they? The beautiful, in the eye of the observer, constantly transforms into the obscene, the sublime into the ridiculous, and the quaintly romantic into the horrific and unspeakable. Without the clarity of intent characteristic of Chagall's other lovers, the quaint romance story which presents itself at a casual glance can only be preserved in the mind of the viewer by the most astute suspension of judgment, by the careful silencing of all improper or disturbing thoughts. It is in this place, where the motive of unity has been thrown out of balance, where the inevitable play of opposites begins. While sublime bliss is out of the question, a love story is still possible, but not inevitable. It could, at any moment, transform suddenly into a comedy of failed romance, or a murderer-stalker scenario. One finds oneself continuously asking, just what are they doing in the dark with all those animals? The woman's hand is raised across her heart, and she holds a bouquet of flowers in her hand. At first, it appears that he has given her the flowers, and she is gushing over the sweet gesture. But why is she turned away from him? Has he brought her all the way out here in the moonlight just to give her flowers and then tell her he's leaving her? Or has he given her flowers, only to find out she's leaving him? But the ambiguity of their situation is the least of our problems. With a few minutes staring at the canvas, it becomes clear that the tail of the rooster in front of her forms the head and enormous beard of a faunish, or perhaps centaurish looking figure, whose form is made up only of the ripples in the darkness. It now appears as though this sinister common animus figure really gave her the flowers, and she is turning from her puny, inadequate lover, with his silly donkey, and preparing to run off with a demon lover. But then, with a few more minutes staring, one sees that this figure actually has his arms around a nude female figure. He has his left hand wrapped around her vulva, and his right hand wrapped around the moon, which hangs vulva-like next to a village tower, which bears an uncanny resemblance to a penis. Without being able to say what is actually going on here, it is certainly evident that the quaintness has disappeared, and the unsettling and potentially very creepy aspects of night and unconsciousness have taken over. Having been led by the Master of Unity and Bliss himself to this unsettling and ambivalent place, let us now explore some of the ways in which the symbolic quest for unity ends in utter disequilibrium and failure. 5.4. Lured beyond the boundaries and cut into tiny pieces, the murderer's rake. The story of the ravishing young man who lures a naive girl away from her home and, out of pure, demonic malice, either stabs her, bashes in her head, poisons her, throws her in the river, takes her out to sea and drowns her, drags her to hell, or any combination of these heinous acts, always comes to its climax in a scene much like the one in Chagall's Lovers, in the dark, far from home, in the wilderness or out at sea, in what the girl assumed would be a love scene. Suddenly and unexpectedly, he turns around and reveals that his intention all along has been to brutally murder her, usually without any explanation. In The Demon Lover, or The House Carpenter, the woman, married to a house carpenter, is convinced that she should leave her husband and go to sea with her former lover, who has returned after a long absence. But when they get out to sea, she begins to weep, longing for the 3 babies that she has abandoned, at which point her lover reveals his demonic nature, sinks the ship, and drags her down to hell with him. In False Sir John, and the variants May Colvin and Lady Isabel and the Elf Knight, the girl, May Colvin, is convinced by False Sir John that she should take all of her father's money and elope with him. After they set out, they stop on a cliff, where he announces his intention to drown her, as he has done to 7 other women. He instructs her first to remove her expensive clothing, for it's too fine and costly to rot in the sea with you. She convinces him that he should be a gentleman and turn around while she undresses, and then runs up behind him and pushes him into the sea, mocking him as he begs for help. No help, no help, oh False Sir John, no help will you get from me, for the bed's no colder to you, sir, than you thought to give to me. This is an interesting gender role reversal, the inverse of its twin story. The female plays the role of trickster and masculine hero, and the darkness becomes a liminal space, in which she transgresses social and gender norms, returning to the safety of home unharmed by her aggressor, and unpunished for her own transgression. At the intersubjective level, these stories have a clear social function, the first clearly stating, if you go very far from home, especially for the purpose of having sex, you will die a violent death and be dragged down to hell, and you will deserve it. The second, using the same story structure, functions to openly flout the values expressed in the first. Structurally, in either case, the polarities are in a state of constant motion and conflict. The values of home and social life, in conflict with a desire for freedom, are either upheld or undermined through symbolic negation of one figure in an opposing pair by another. Total annihilation in the cause of unity, nature's eternal refusal of culture in Pyramus and Thisbe and Rossini. Ovid's tale of Pyramus and Thisbe 55 takes place in a frame of unsettling darkness, much like the scene in Chagall's painting. Ultimately, it is uncertainty and unconsciousness which led to the lover's demise. The natural course of Eris, the driving force compelling the lovers toward one another, has been cut off in process in the story. The young lovers, living in connected houses, are forbidden to see one another, their emerging sexuality having been appropriated and planned in terms of its commodity value years before, by families for which mate selection is a matter of institutional priority, a political and business transaction, but that which Eris wants, Eris seeks out, finding a way out through or around externally constructed barriers. But, in the process of this displacement, it is distorted, forced into the dark. Having agreed, speaking through a tiny hole in the wall, to meet and run away together, Thisbe waits in the dark for her lover, by the mulberry tree where they had agreed to meet. Running to hide from a lioness, she drops a veil, and the lioness runs off with it in her bloody jaws. Pyramus, believing she has been devoured, stabs himself to death, and Thisbe, upon finding his body, does the same. The living force of conscious life has been stifled and distorted in this narrative by the arbitrary divisions of culture, with the contents of the narrative prevented from forming a structural arrangement through which errors can flow. The characters are forced into the dark, outside all the boundaries of civilized life, underdeveloped and wrapped about in fear and ignorance. The opposites achieve unity only through mutual negation. A perverse symmetry has nonetheless established itself here. Facing one another across the wall, the opposites, seeking unification at all costs, make a circuit through the wilderness. Having been denied unity in conscious life, they merge together again beyond the boundaries of civilization, their blood pouring together in death. The final outcome of its story is that the mulberry tree gets its color from the blood of the sacrifice. It is in the sense of fertility myth, all of civilization's structures being founded on the distortion and rechanneling of the forces of human life to serve the ends of institutions over which they have no control. A similar story is told in the ballad Farewell, Dear Orsini, with notable variations, but the same basic story structure. Whereas Pyramus and Thisbe ends in the darkness where Chagall leaves off, the ballad opens with this scene. Jean Ritchie's unaccompanied voice, angelic but not overly cultivated, singing in the wide, leaping intervals typical of the child ballads, seems to echo eerily through the thick darkness of the opening scene, as Chagall's thick, swirling night twists about in the wide spaces between the notes, filling the silence between the phrases as it does the space between the couple in Elle Tent. We must use our imaginations, as she did not record this song. Allemande, Rossini's lover, stands outside her window in the night. This opening scene is a motif all its own, which can serve as a point of departure for a number of contrasting scenarios, such as the Night Visitor song, or its parent ballad Sweet William's Ghost, in which the visitor approaches his lover's window in the night, briefly unites with her in blissful Chagallesque union, and as quickly departs when Chagall's ever-present rooster begins to crow. The first line after the opening chorus, and as he came up to his true love's window, which promises to be a lovely tale, so long as we are able to presume that his true love reciprocates this sentiment, also opens up some disturbing possibilities. Not a sound. I am Sextus Tarquinius. I am armed. If you utter a word, I will kill you. In Farewell, Dear Orsini, however, the Night Visitor scene only lasts 2 verses, in which it is established that, like Pyramus and Thisbe, Rossini and Allemande have been forbidden to consummate their love by Rossini's parents, who have arranged her marriage to a nobleman. As he expresses his despair, Rossini's parents come to the window and tell him that Rossini is already married. Allemande, in his despair, decides to go to sea, and is drowned in a gale the very next morning. One sailor survives, floats back on a hogshead, and spreads the news that all of the sailors have been lost at sea. When Rossini hears this, she shouts out a curse against cruel parents, and all of the social ties to which they sacrifice their children's lives, as she stabs herself to death. She pulled out her dagger and pierced her body through Rossini's blood sprinkled like an evening dew, crying curse cruel parents wherever they may be, they all slight their own children in many a degree. Again we have a natural structure through which an essential and vital guiding force of life seeks to manifest itself, stifled from above by a subordinating structure. At the level of archetypal symbol, the self in its entirety has been crushed and suffocated beneath an externally oriented persona, and of course, at the socio-cultural level, the very real and tangible subordination of human beings' lives and wills to the designs of institutions whose only functions are to expand their boundaries of domination. and to rank all things within these boundaries under their mechanistic hierarchies. The natural unifying function of there is thus displaced and contextualized. Unity becomes impossible within a crippled and distorted structure. Unification transforms into annihilation, and Eris becomes death. Whether they pay their rhetorical lip service to the external determinism of the social theorists, or conversely to the internal determinism of medical psychiatry is of little import. What matters is that we as living, feeling, dreaming human beings are surrounded on all sides by corporations, states, educational institutions, and their willing foot soldiers, who want nothing more than to create a world devoid of all human emotion, by embracing as positive and liberating the notion that there is a human nature which manifests itself through the emotional life, not as a dictatorship of the sex organs, but as a positive, generative life force which drives us to seek out community, companionship, happiness, and liberation from the forces that impede us in these ends. We may conceivably, with much luck and struggle, be able to resist these forces of estrangement and alienation. We can begin by seeing the products of human creativity not simply as mirrors of the social structure, or vessels for the delivery of propaganda, though they are quite clearly turned to those purposes, but rather as the means by which we can take the world as it presents itself, and transform it through creative response, creating the templates for a future which we must choose to create. The politicians are unskilled and oafish sculptors who, with blunt chisels, use living souls as the medium for their hideous crafts. A better world will not be created by people who reduce all art to an epiphenomenon of the episteme, but only by people who have embraced the world of feeling as something living and vital, and learned how to turn the world outside into the reflection of this inward beauty. The better we know this created life, the better able we will be to know when it is being turned toward malevolent and deceptive ends, and the better we will be able to reclaim it as a force of transcendence. We can begin by declaring unequivocally the notion that aesthetics, by its very nature, lends itself to fascism. 65 is simply slanderous and fallacious. Life is susceptible to misdirection and misuse, but only ascetics and intellectuals think they can cure it by refusing to live. Let us reclaim, without shame or fear, the antiquated notion that life is beautiful and progress is possible, and may all who disagree go and stab themselves to death in the drop.
Epilogue. What is the apotheosis of the aesthetic? We could take this to mean many things, from the ominous to the trivial. Perhaps we mean the well-precedented aestheticization of the political, the making beautiful of atrocity. This is not what we mean. Perhaps we mean the even better precedented politicization of the aesthetic, an endless array of lounge singers to serenade the star on his long climb, subordination of the beautiful to the ends of the party. This is not what we mean. These polarities are singular in their subordination, commodification, enslavement, and estrangement of the primary human drive, in their usurpation and exploitation of humanity's transcendent function, of the will to sublimation, in their chaining of the aesthetic demon to the machinery of ideology. This is not what we mean. Perhaps we mean that rock and roll will save the world. For fuck's sake, this is not what we mean. What we mean is that all activities which make the existing socio-economic political structures the target of their agitation, all actions which aspire toward the positive transmutation and evolution of the social, toward the collective and individual liberation of humankind, if they are to make such a conceit in earnest, in good faith, must never for one moment stray from the one true end, without which all the petty bread and circuses of economic revolution are but a respirator for humanity's dying gasps, a bit of prolonging of boredom and misery, to which nuclear annihilation would be infinitely preferable. That other world in which all human beings might make their own creative apotheosis, their own consent to the beautiful and the sublime, into the passing core of both their individual and collective existence, in which all work activities serve to facilitate the means to truly creative ends, a world in which the end of our labor is collective and individual ecstasy, in which the means of subsistence will become indistinguishable from the means of creative joy, in which the common act of sustenance is conceived as humanity's collaborative masterpiece, in which work and art become tautology, the zealot of revolution who does not carry the scent in the very core of their being, into every life act, who does not hold the immediacy of this drive to total human collective individuation as an article of unwavering devotion, is no more than a goon, and the goons will have their hell, prepared by humanity for the putrescent trinity of fascism, Stalinism, and capitalism. There will be no humanity but humanity, and this total humanity will become its own absolute work of sublime living art. From the all-consuming love of humanity for itself, shines the infinite light of the dawn of our self-becoming.
7. Appendix. General remarks. The symbol, a didactic poem in blocky hexameter verses. The symbol is at the nexus of sociological structures and the emotional cognitive structures of the brain and body. Its contents and its structure emerge both out of the social and the individual structures of the unconscious, which is both internal, neurologically structured, and external, shaped by environmental constraints and the infrastructural conditions of history. The former, the individual neurostructural, is collective, insofar as its internal structure, albeit with diverse variations, is identical with that of every other phenotype of the genus. The latter determinants, those of the socio-environmental, are collective insofar as they contain our bodies, and insofar as their emergent, determinant motions constitute the stimuli by which the internal faculties of response form behaviors which are specific, within the range of possible organismic behaviors, to the particular cultural and historical epoch. All that needs to be said concerning metaphysics. Phylogeny contains the phenotypic variations of ontogeny. Ontogeny flaps the constants of phylogeny. Phylogeny makes constant ontogenies perpetual anomaly. Ontogeny anomalizes phylogeny. Preponderance of the very great. The preponderance of the very small. Time. All around the desolate valley of the infinite. The countless crying moments grieve eternity's refusal of time. On love. Why I like Chagall so much. It must be remembered that when I respect the world and its particularity, I also deny it a context, a history, an identity beyond its confines. I atomize it. The response is that I should see it in its archetypal glory. The great, when I adulate the world in its archetypal glory, I deny it its particularity, its discontinuity, its idiosyncratic strangeness, its never-again-ness. The urgency of time's disappearance that drives capitalism to his frenzy. Souls oxidia retridia possent nobis cum semiluxidit, brevis lux nox state perpetua una dominda. The only way through is sincerity, the best semblance we can make of it. We must confront the world as ourselves, and ourselves with openness to our own unknowing ignorance. The self between us lies at the nexus of our sincere projections. This is not the moment of correspondence to an alien truth, but the moment of erotic consensus, of illusory sympathy, of harmonious intersubjectivity. This is the making of a singular world, which we consent to call the real, and grieving its passing, we call the desirable. The lost, the never. Here, in this place, love longs to hold the other forever. Self as itself, and in opposition to itself, as eternal companion in the silence of its perfect aloneness. The disappearance of the beloved is incomprehensible, and duality persists in death. Like the aching limb of the amputee. The individual's disappearance into death is a necrosis on love's totality. Love cannot fathom this discontinuity, insisting that one of its bodies has only again fallen back out of time. Who is your final comforter when you come out of yourself to walk in the world? And the one who smiles at the threshold when you return to go back in? The one who buried you, and to whom you were born again? Such a question could never make sense except to someone who can answer it without thought, without hesitation. That is the moment of erotic totality, of absolute empathy. The moment of correspondence of the conceptual templates, the meeting of the illusion with the consent of the other's illusion, knowing that even in the moment of disillusion, all of its ecstasy will echo out in each moment of anguish. This is the moment of exquisite pain, the blood that love feeds on. Woe to the legions who have never rested in the silence of that passing infant. Love is the moment in which, without irony, we say this, not only of the beloved, or of ourselves, or of life, but of being. Love is the binding illusion which holds up each consummate world. Each world is undermined by the internal depths of its smallness and superseded by the infinity which it must wake to. Love holds the world in the life-giving lie of benevolent semblance, nursing it with the sustaining illusion of its own existence. Everything about love is a lie until death lies down with it. Death is eternal. Death is the stillness that love seeks. To lie in death is the place where there are no divisions and no definitions. Death is the place where the free, silent moment will finally be endless, where all the kisses are scattered asunder, no one may count them. Phylogenetic dimorphic behaviors come out the more strongly, the less individuated the individuals are. It is in the fully developed person, the full human being, that these crude differences, mainly in matters of sex and aggression, fade into the fullness of the self. Constellation, becoming undetectable, or when such things are desired. The uproarious tropes of sadism and masochism, the interchangeable customary of erotic abuses in which the beautiful and the sublime become the erotic, and in the mutual play of prostration and self-denigration become the omnipotent alkaline light, and the silence of death.
General remarks on in the general direction of a critical romantic socio-phenomenological humanist program of art, life and politics. In rejoinder to at least one drunken allegation of fascism, my sub-thesis is that the ideal state of self-actualization, which I without apology speak of in an essentialist way, which I believe the ego machine can pretty well back up these days, was quite elegantly explicated in profound nuance by Schiller, whose masterful anticipation of the be-sensitive whole person and find your feminine side and eat your granola pop psychology of today was subsequently violently chopped into by continental philosophers, who established ichtemus religions of the Ding and Sitch, irresponsibly ignoring the still quite unrefuted constraints of Kantian phenomenalism. The result was, on the one hand, the total externalization of the formal instinct, as seen in the descendants of Hegel, and the constructionist sociological orientation of the critical school, which projects highly symmetrical patterns onto a chaotic history, mistaking them for science, while slighting the internal structures of subjective experience, aside from a flirtation with Freud, for whom the unconscious is just an unstructured waste dump. On the other hand,
The descendants of Schopenhauer elevated a crude and purely destructive conception of the sensual instinct, leading either to nihilistic individualism in the various Nietzscheisms, or the expression of the romantic elevation of passion within the narrow strictures of folkish xenophobia and the poisonous fetishism of geography and race. It is my belief that Romanticism is to Nazism, as democracy was to governing structure of Athens. The elevation of the noblest ideas among a tiny minority who were making it their business to plunder and destroy everything outside of the narrow confines of what they considered humanity. In the humanities, it results in a false dichotomy between an obscurant behaviorism, which poses as the legitimate representative of all oppressed peoples, and a fascistic, Platonic essentialism which may or may not exist at all. My intention is to re-establish the centrality of art as a primary human activity, for which there is certainly a well-established empirical case. It is good for you and will make you happy. As I stated in Chapter 0, this basic need is trounced upon by all of the major political systems that have arisen in modernity. As delineated by Benjamin, fascism proceeds by making the state a canvas, socialism by demanding that all art should be about socialism, or else, and capitalism by replacing it with Andy Warhol and McDonald's. Having established this, I make the claim that the celebratory enjoyment, the aesthetic as something of essential value, is not in the least incompatible with a critical political approach to its social functions and the ways in which the symbolic and the beautiful are employed, consciously or unconsciously, to serve the ends of ideology. It is in fact only by the embrace of a holistic essentialism that an explanatory framework can finally emerge for effectiveness of within perpetuating false consciousness. The approaches are thus complementary. The polarities of folkish subjectivism and totalistic Marxian formalism are analogous to the uncultivated states of sense and form as defined by Schiller. The former he referred to as savagery, the latter as barbarism. Later, Camus would refer to these polarities culminating in Stalinism and Nazism as rational and irrational violence, respectively, both of which he found, as do I, equally repugnant. What I seek out in the political, psychological, phenomenological, and aesthetic fields are exemplary figures whose works represent a refusal, in the genuine, inclusive humanistic sense, of the false dichotomy between individualism and collectivity, between the creative and practical needs of human beings, between the subjective phenomenological and the objective sociological poles of living experience, and, above all, who acknowledge the basic human need for creative and meaningful life activity over and above crude basics of food, medicine, clothing, shelter, and physical protection. In philosophical aesthetics, I have already mentioned Schiller. In poetry, Shelley stands out particularly, with his refusal of the distinction between the programs of Romanticism and the Enlightenment. For him, the revolutionary striving for political liberty was synonymous with the liberation of the human emotional life. He had a wife who is pretty groovy too. Politically, I would sweep away the pointy-headed abstractions of a century of critical theory, and replace it with Piotr Kropotkin and his descendants up to Chomsky. His critique of all modern political systems and modes of production is every bit as relentless, but maintains an unwavering respect for the individual as the basic unit making up the social, and a deeply humanistic insistence on the existence of a nature which is constructive, positive and purposive, forming the biological basis for such basic and ubiquitous phenomena as mutual aid, nurturing and empathy, and the ever-recurrent revolt of human communities against the structures of political power, which simply would not happen if we were only empty vessels of culturally conditioned ideology. Phenomenologically, I would replace in the humanities the various descendants of Freud with Jung, who does indeed have his own problems, but is deserving of at least the same charitable process of revision that has dumbfoundingly turned Freud, of all people, into a feminist and a rainbow flag-waving LGBTSTVQ parade zealot. You can turn Jung into those things with a lot less work, and the structure of his interpretive approach, while indeed not science, would place literary and art criticism in an ontological framework which is broadly metaphorically compatible with things that are now understood in the behavioral, neurological, and evolutionary sciences. Given his work's deep roots in the ethology and anthropology of the time, indeed his software is outdated. But I'm speaking of paradigmatic frames, and not the canonical elevation of the primary texts here. As an artistic exemplar, I nominate Chagall, whose depictions of Eros embody indeterminate concept, the free play of the faculties, and the unified simultaneity of absolute unity and binary differentiation, in which the duality of his subjects merge androgynously into one another, and together merge into the surrounding world, in which time, space and object are united in a seamless organic unity, but in which the particularity of each subject always remains. Throughout his work, an all-encompassing cosmopolitanism is inseparable from his Gemeinschaftsgefühl for his native village of Vitebsk. Musicologically, I believe this approach to life is exemplified by Moses Ash, founder of Ash Records, later Smithsonian Folkways, whose radical universalism consisted not in the then quite popular quest for global conformity and homogeneity, but rather in the pluralistic celebration of the radical locality of the creative traditions of all human cultures. This insistence upon the symbiosis of radical localism with absolute universalism in the context of a radically anti-authoritarian ethics constitutes the only approach to politics, aesthetics, ethics and phenomenology which offers a solution to the tripartite program of human extinction which emanates from the radically anti-humanistic authoritarian camps of atomistic commodity culture, totalistic statist collectivism, and Völkisch humanism, just for us humans, identity politics. While one might wish to play a superficial game of 6 degrees to Adolf Hitler, that analogy is deeply superficial. I believe that an ideology of liberation is a paradoxical proposition, so it is only as a last point that I formulated the set of political ideological slogans which constitute the apotheosis of the aesthetic above, to make clear that insofar as organized political activity of any kind is necessary in the world, I, and you should too, categorically renounce, with the utmost vehemence, any and all agendas which 1. Subjugate the creative potentials of the human being to their perverse quest for political power, and 2. Do not regard the authentic realization of this creative potential of every human being as an immediate necessity, not an abstract, symbolic, or rhetorical slogan. Again, I refer the reader to Kropotkin, who devotes the better part of the conquest of bread to what he terms the need for luxury. He makes very clear that all of the physical provisions of society are but precursors for this. Whereas his socialist rivals spoke of these things as distant goals, putting them off to the end of history, Kropotkin made art, music and good food, not just food, the immediate goal of his revolutionary fantasy novel. In his plan, these would have been the primary activities of the community in a matter of weeks, not decades or centuries, or as is really the case in all of our existing political systems, never. No, I do not believe that such a transformation is literally possible, but it is the only acceptable normative template I can think of upon which to gauge our actions and activities within the constraints of the possible world. If we are to have ideals, they should be good ones, and big ones. If you want something practical out of me, that sees it in the real world, I would, referring the reader to the forthcoming empirical section on the beneficial effects of drawing, painting, singing and whatevering. demand an immediate end to the fiscal war against funding for arts and humanities education. I would insist, in fact, that it be made a matter of public health policy, on an equal footing with physical education, nutrition, medicine and shelter. It is important not to raise a civilization of dullards and morons, and it just might help to teach people from a very early age that they are capable of something, even in the absence of resources. I would insist upon making anthropology and ethnomusicology part of the core curriculum of early childhood education, stamping into the pigsty, once and for all, our contemporary belief that these subjects are just junk college majors for kids that didn't do good in math.